It was a gamble unlike any that we've seen so far in the Ukraine war. On August 6th, Ukraine sent a small contingent of soldiers into the Russian region of Kursk. Early reports suggested that anywhere between 300 and 1,000 soldiers had crossed the border, having broken through the poorly defended Russian fortifications on the front lines to make the journey. Since then, Ukraine has kept pushing. Its soldiers continue to move through Kursk, with some even making their way to Belgorod, and the entire complexion of the Ukraine war has changed. For the first time, Russia is being forced to defend itself on its own territory, a situation that seemed unfathomable in February 2022 when the entire world was shaken by President Vladimir Putin and his special military operation. Ever since that Kursk invasion, there's been a key question circulating in the media and among Ukraine's allies. Why? Ukraine's capture of Russian territory in Kursk isn't so much about holding Russian land as it is about changing Russia's entire approach to the war. After all, it's forced Putin to pull troops out of vital areas in Ukraine to defend Russia, which is a situation that will only benefit Ukraine as the war takes its next dramatic turn. But before we get into Russia and Putin's decision to pull his units out of Ukraine, let's dig a little deeper into what's happening in Kursk right now. In an interview with the BBC on August 13th, a Ukrainian soldier named Tomasz explained some of what happened on August 6th. "We had orders to come here, but we didn't know what they meant," he said while drinking coffee at a gas station inside Kursk. Those orders were surprisingly simple. The evening of August 6th saw a small contingent of Ukrainian troops cross the border between Ukraine and Russia, entering the region of Kursk. Since then, the Ukrainians have advanced rapidly. Those early incursions saw it seize 28 settlements, as confirmed by Russia's Ministry of Defense, as well as the Sudsa gas metering station, owned by Gazprom, which is Russia's largest energy supplier. That station transmits Russian natural gas to the rest of Europe. It's a key part of the country's European energy infrastructure, and now it's under Ukrainian control. Though, as Gazprom itself claims, the emerging satellite imagery of damage to the station doesn't mean that Ukraine has destroyed it. Yet, we suppressed the enemy's means of communication and surveillance in advance to clear the way, continued Tomasz, who remarked that the entire operation was far simpler than he would have thought. Those comments have been echoed in photos and video footage that have started emerging on the Telegram social media platform in the days since the initial invasion. One such video shows a soldier who claims that months of planning went into the operation, with its goal being to force Russia to move troops to other parts of the front lines. The element of surprise worked, claims the soldier in the clip. "We entered easily, with little resistance. On August 6th, first groups crossed at night in several directions. Russia's poorly manned defenses on the border couldn't stop these initial groups. What followed was nothing short of a remarkable Ukrainian advancement into Russian territory. That initial group of 1,000 is now believed to be growing in number, though reports are starting to conflict one another. On August 13th, the BBC noted that Ukraine's President Zelensky is now claiming that Ukraine holds 74 settlements in Kursk. Russia's defense ministry hasn't commented since its initial confirmation that 28 settlements had been overrun, meaning there's little reason to doubt Ukraine's claims. Whatever the case may be, it doesn't change the fact that Ukraine now controls villages and towns inside Russian territory. It's a sharp humiliation for Putin that also changes the entire complexion of the war. Ukraine is also claiming that it now controls about 386 square miles of Russian territory in Kursk, though the BBC says that is a disputed claim. The Institute for the Study of War, for example, says that while Ukrainian soldiers may be spread out that far, it's unlikely that the entire region is under the Ukrainian army's complete control. What is more certain is that Russian civilians are fleeing Kursk in droves. The BBC says that 121,000 have left their homes so far, many on their way to Moscow to escape the war that's coming to their doorstep. A further 180,000 have been told they need to leave, meaning Ukraine's invasion has forced the temporary displacement of nearly 200,000 Russian civilians in the space of a week. Moscow is preparing to welcome as many of those people as possible, having set up 400 shelters across the country that will serve as makeshift homes for up to 30,000 evacuees. But it's clear that the scale of the escape from Kursk is growing beyond Moscow's control. It barely has enough shelters to handle a sixth of the people who've been displaced so far. All of this implies that the Kursk offensive has been extremely successful so far. But that success doesn't answer the question we posed at the beginning of the video. Why did Ukraine choose launch its invasion now? It's not about taking territory, at least according to Ukraine's foreign ministry. On the afternoon of August 13th, a claim came out that Ukraine was not interested in taking territory, with the supposed goal being broader than that. A spokesperson for the ministry said, "So the Kursk invasion is actually about bringing an end to the entire war. Then? Perhaps it is, in part. But there's a far more immediate and practical reason for Zelensky taking such a massive gamble. Ukrainian troops invading Kursk will force Russia to deploy soldiers it has stationed elsewhere to deal with them. And that action will have a far greater impact on the war than many realize. We're already seeing this happen. On August 13th, a week after the Kursk invasion began, Politico ran an article in which it reported on the comments of Ukrainian army spokesperson Dmitry Lukovy. He claimed that invasion had left Moscow scrambling, forcing Putin to not only express anger, but claim that the West was responsible for the invasion. The Russian president claims that Russia will mount a worthy response to Ukraine's actions, with that response appearing to be pulling troops out of other locations to send to Kursk. Russia has relocated some of its units from both the Zaporizhia and Kherson regions of Ukraine's south, Lukovy claims. This move is notable because those regions were among the first that Russia attacked when Putin launched his special military operation in February 2022. Kherson, in particular, was a major early victory for Russia. Symbolically, it was the first major Ukrainian city to fall to the Russian invasion, allowing Putin to proclaim an early victory in his operation. But perhaps more important is Kherson's location. With a population of 380,000 people, Kherson lies on the banks of the Dnipro River, giving Russia key access to the city via the Black Sea. In the early days of the war, this access was seen as vital. Russia's into Kherson via Crimea, allowing Putin to reinforce his armies in South Ukraine. Of course, we now know that the war hasn't played out quite like that, with Ukraine managing to use missiles and drone strikes to take out a third of the Black Sea fleet. That part of the fleet wasn't rendered completely useless, but Russia is far warier about using it now than it was when it first took Kherson. Still, this proximity to Crimea is important to both sides. For Russia, it's due to the logistical advantages, and for Ukraine, because Kherson acts as a sort of gateway to the annexed territory. Crimea has been under Russian control since 2014, with taking back Crimea likely being a key objective for Ukraine in the war. Kherson is important in that, as Dr. Marina Mirin, who researches defense studies at the King's College London, explains. Recapturing it would pave the way to reconquering Crimea, which Ukraine aims to do in this war. Back to the city's importance. Kherson offers access to the Dnipro River, a waterway that runs right into the center of Ukraine. Again, that river could serve as a major supply line for Russia as it advances closer to Kyiv from the south. Why does any of this matter in the context of Kursk? Russia removing troops from Kherson means that it's prioritizing the protection of its own territory over the retaking of important territory in Ukraine. It weakens the assaults Russia can carry out on a key Ukrainian city, and one that Russia controlled in the early months of the war, allowing Ukraine to refortify Kherson, so it becomes much harder for Russia to retake once it's resolved the Kursk issue. However, it's unknown just how many troops Russia has redeployed. Blakovy suggests that Russia has moved a relatively small number of soldiers from Kherson to Kursk, meaning there will still be Russian forces in the city. That could be a miscalculation by Putin. Though Ukraine invaded Kursk with a small number of soldiers itself, as around 1,000 crossed the border, those soldiers have succeeded by creating anarchy in the oblast. Roving units are destroying Russian defenses at small settlements, followed by larger units of Ukrainian troops that secure those settlements and fortify them. A relatively small number of Russian soldiers isn't likely to be able to dislodge the Ukrainian soldiers from their positions quickly. Plus, now that Ukraine has broken through to Kursk, nothing is stopping it from reinforcing those positions it's taken with soldiers of its own. In short, the Kursk invasion has forced Putin into a change of tactics. However, it may not have forced the change that Ukraine wanted. While troops moving out of Kherson is important, Ukraine would have preferred Russia to move soldiers away from the Donetsk region. Al Jazeera said as much in a video published on August 12th, in which it claimed that the invasions of Kursk and Belgorod were intended to change the dynamics in Donetsk by forcing Russia to send troops from that region. That would relieve some pressure on Ukrainian forces stationed in and around that city. which have faced constant bombardment as Russia attempts to secure more territory in the Donbass. But Donetsk remains in Russia's focus. Back in February 2024, Reuters reported that Russia was firing anywhere between 1,500 and 2,500 rockets and artillery shells at the war-torn city daily, with its goal being to take out key infrastructure before winter in hopes of forcing more of the city's population out by the end of the year. Ukraine is trying to hold Russia back in the eastern province. Russia currently holds about 57% of Donetsk, but the constant pressure has been telling. Ukraine wanted to ease that pressure. However, Putin's response of pulling soldiers out of Kursk suggests that won't happen. As Politico points out, Russia has instead tried to counter Ukraine's gains by launching refreshed offensives in Pokrovsk, which is in the Donetsk region, alongside other locations in Donetsk. For now, Russia seems satisfied with pulling troops out of Kursk, along with sending troops from Kaliningrad into Kursk. That's according to Laurynas Kasčiūnas, the Lithuanian defense minister, who claims that Lithuania has spotted Russian troops leaving Kaliningrad in the wake of the Kursk invasion. All of this adds up to a fairly confused response on the part of Russia. Likovy said as much when speaking to Ukrainian TV, noting that Russia launched several attacks on Kursk, even as it withdrew some of its forces to send to Kursk. We must still understand whether it's a smokescreen activity, he noted. But trying to create a smokescreen could backfire on Putin. If the army is only diverting small numbers of troops to tackle the Kursk problem, with the focus remaining on the Donetsk and Kursk regions, Russia may find itself losing even more territory. A small contingent isn't going to stop Ukraine's advance, especially given how meager the Russian defenses were initially. Those small numbers of troops will run into far stronger Ukrainian fortifications, as well as having to deal with the potential for Ukraine to send more soldiers into Kursk. So these former Kursk-on units are attacked from both sides. Only one thing is certain. Putin has been forced to change his approach to the Ukraine war. For the first time since the war began, he's not fighting on his own terms. Instead, he's having to respond to a successful Ukrainian offensive that has brought the war into Russia, regardless of the nature of his response. This is something that Putin neither anticipated nor prepared for, meaning that he's been humiliated as Ukraine shows he hasn't done enough to defend the Russian people. Let's focus back on Kherson for a bit. Though the removal of troops from that pivotal city may seem like a huge bond for Ukraine, the reality is that Russia had already done something similar back in November 2022. Several months after taking Kherson, Putin ordered the withdrawal of many of his soldiers stationed in the city as they stared down a Ukrainian counterattack that they likely wouldn't be able to handle. Ukraine successfully liberated the city 9 months after it was taken. However, Kherson was far from a secure area following this liberation. As AP News reported in November 2022, the departing Russian forces littered the city's streets with landmines that one Ukrainian official noted could render Kherson a city of death. Mikhailo Podolyak made those claims and another that would turn out to be prescient. Russia would start shelling Kherson intensely after it relocated its troops to the other side of the Dnipro River. That's exactly what happened. As CNN reported in February 2024, the successful liberation of Kherson by Ukraine didn't result in the city becoming a safe haven for its people or a location from which Ukraine could organize attacks against Russian positions in the south. The shelling that Podolyak predicted soon came, with residents describing the level of drones and artillery pounding away at the city to be at the worst levels they'd seen since the beginning of the war. The Dnipro riverside is now lined with trenches, and the endless storm of artillery has left Kursk on a broken husk, where broken glass and destroyed buildings line the streets. Pessimism has reigned in Kherson for 2 years. CNN reports that repair workers have taken to making dark jokes, with one saying his team celebrated the 10,000th window they'd boarded up in the wake of the Russian attacks. Kherson may not have become the city of death that Podolyak envisioned in terms of Russian landmines, but Russia has spent almost the entire war ensuring that the city would have no chance of recovery following its forced withdrawal in November 2022. All of which brings us back to the Kursk invasion. Perhaps now we're starting to see more of Ukraine's strategy crystallizing. Zelensky made a huge gamble when he okayed the Kursk invasion. He bet that Russia would be able to do little to stop his soldiers from entering Russian territory and, crucially, that he wouldn't face any blowback from the West for taking the war into Russian territory. The gamble paid off. Ukraine is in Russia, and the West isn't telling Zelensky that his leave. The success of that gamble has forced Putin to rethink his strategy. That's evident in the troop diversions we've spoken of. Russia is weakening its position in Kherson to send troops into Kursk. That's ideal for Zelensky, as Ukraine only intends to hold Russian territory for as long as is needed to achieve its own aims. With Russian soldiers leaving Kherson, perhaps now could be a time for Ukraine to consolidate its position in that city properly and prepare to defend it against future Russian attacks. There's also the Donetsk region to consider. Yes, Zelensky would have liked to see Russian soldiers diverted from that region in response to the Kursk invasion, but that hasn't happened yet. Given that we don't know just how many soldiers Putin is sending to Kursk, it's still very possible that Ukraine could fend off the initial Russian response, forcing Russia to divert troops from elsewhere. If Zelensky's luck holds out, that elsewhere could be Donetsk, which would again afford Ukraine time to not only refortify, but to potentially launch counterattacks against weakened Russian forces. But Ukraine may have had other goals with the Kursk invasion. Disrupting Russian logistics could be one of them. As part of the newest invasion, Ukraine has seized a key Russian gas transmission station. It's also taking territory, through which Russia might have sent reinforcements into Donetsk. Now, around 200,000 people are being evacuated from Kursk, with the region becoming far less useful to Putin. As the Kyiv Independent points out, the incursion could also halt cross-border attacks from Kursk, allowing Ukrainian soldiers to not only regroup, but also redeploy closer to Donetsk to shore up Ukraine's defenses. That means two more goals may have been achieved. Even if Russian soldiers aren't pulled from Donetsk, Ukraine has made it much more difficult for Russia to send reinforcements into the region. And with Russia now trying to retake Kursk, rather than fight Ukraine on its own territory in the north, Ukraine can send more soldiers to Donetsk. If nothing else, the invasion has forced a stretching of the front lines. That's according to ABC News, which wrote that Zelensky's decision to invade Kursk was a bold gamble, given that he was encroaching on the territory of a nuclear-armed country. A country that's made multiple threats to use tactical nukes in Ukraine. Those threats haven't come to fruition, with Putin only able to muster a meager response to the Ukrainian incursion. Evacuations and troop diversions, rather than a nuclear holocaust, have been the results. That's yet another way that Zelensky's big gamble has paid off. It's shown that crossing the final red line and invading Russia doesn't come with the repercussions that Putin claimed it would. Whatever happens in Kursk from this point forth, Ukraine has achieved a symbolic victory against Putin. It's demonstrated that there is a far lighter bite behind the Russian president's nuclear barking, which opens the door for future incursions into Russian territory. It also shows the rest of Europe that Ukraine is still worth backing in this war, and that Russia may not present the level of threat many believed it did in the past. A chink in Putin's armor has been revealed, with the strongman of Russian politics being shown as somebody who doesn't always back up his word. That's not the only chink that Zelensky's gamble revealed. The mere fact that Ukraine was able to launch the Kursk invasion in the first place shows the strategic weakness of the Russian approach to the war. So focused was Putin on achieving his objectives in Donetsk that he failed to secure the front lines in North Ukraine. Arrogance may have played a part here. Putin likely didn't anticipate that Ukraine would even consider an invasion into Kursk or any other Russian territory, leading him to dedicating just enough to the northern front lines to occupy Ukraine in its own territory. That approach has clearly backfired. With Ukrainian forces now in Kursk, the war's front lines have been expanded and stretched, with the result being what we're currently seeing. Russia is having to weaken its positions elsewhere to handle the Kursk problem. Of course, there's a wrinkle to this strategy. Stretching the front lines has just as much of an impact on Ukraine as it does on Russia. Ukraine's commander of the 14th Regiment of Unmanned Drones, identified only through his codename of Charlie by ABC, says as much. The stretching of the front line for us is also stretching the front line for the enemy, he claims. Only we have prepared for this operation in detail. The Russians were not prepared for this operation at all. In other words, Ukraine has accounted for the impact the stretching of the front lines will have. A metaphorical stacking of the deck and Zelensky's big gamble resulting in the front line expansion working out in Ukraine's favor. There's another way that Zelensky's big gamble has proven to be a strategic masterstroke. It's resulted in the capture of several hundred Russian conscripts, many of whom were only recently installed in Putin's army, as according to the live tracker Sky News has put in place following the initial Kursk invasion. On August 15th, it reported on claims from Zelensky that Ukraine had captured around 100 Russian prisoners of war during the previous 24 hours. with many dozens more having been caught between August 6th and 13th. That represents a more literal weakening of Russia's front line, as those are soldiers who will no longer be able to fight against Ukraine. Russia will have to replace those captured conscripts, which creates another explanation on why it's diverting troops away from Kherson and other regions to send to Kursk. Finally, there's the major propaganda victory Ukraine has achieved as a result of its Kursk invasion. On August 15th, Sky News published a report on the captured Russians, in which its reporters actually spoke to some of those who'd been captured. It described the detainees as generally being young conscripts, many aged between 19 and 21, who had absolutely no idea how to respond when Ukraine invaded. The men who were unnamed, and now shown in pictures, said that Ukraine's attack happened extremely quickly, and they simply surrendered rather than fighting back. They claimed their families had no idea what had happened to them, with some expressing hope that their capture would lead to a prisoner exchange at some point. That's damaging to Putin in several ways. As Sky News points out, he said at several points during the war that conscripts wouldn't be sent near the front lines until they were more experienced. These captures refute that claim. Most people to whom Sky News spoke were young men recently conscripted and placed in vulnerable positions. Not only does this make Putin look like a liar, but it exposes weaknesses in his army. Are Russia's manpower issues so severe that it's being forced to use barely trained conscripts as the first line of defense against Ukrainian forces? The Kursk invasion would certainly suggest so. Worse yet for Putin, his reputation as a strongman has been damaged. That's according to Sky News security and defense editor Deborah Haynes, who says that it's become impossible for Putin to hide this invasion from the Russian people. For a politician, a former spy, who has spent his career building a reputation of being a strongman, to have his country invaded in this way, it must be a huge blow to President Putin. All of this leads us to a final question. What happens next? That question is difficult to answer. The odds seem high that Ukraine is going to fortify its positions in Kursk, ready to fight against the troops that Putin is diverting from Kursk. That fortification could result in more Russian losses, leading to more troop diversions. The longer Ukraine can hold the 74 settlements it's taken in Kursk, the more time it gives itself to take advantage of the stretching of the front lines. That could open the door for more counteroffensives in Donetsk, assuming Putin is forced to divert troops from this critical region, as well as the fortification of Kursk and the countering of artillery strikes that have battered the city for so long. All that being said, Kursk wasn't the objective. It was a gamble played to perfection by Zelensky that's completely changed the layout of the war. Putin is now being forced to respond while facing the humiliation of being the first Russian leader since World War II to allow another country to invade Russian territory. In the end, the damage the Kursk invasion has caused to Putin may be just as valuable as the forcing of troops to relocate. But what do you think? What are the long-term ramifications of Ukraine's invasion of Kursk, and what do you make of Putin's response so far? Could the stretching of the front line open up opportunities elsewhere? Share your opinions in the comments below, and thank you for watching this video. Now, go and check out the shocking results of Ukraine's invasion into Russia, or click this other video instead.